Howdy, y'all. Socialism on Roids here with another unscripted, off the cuff rant. That's socialism on roids, kryptonite for conservatives. I'm off my roids, off my rocker, and on the warpath. Here we go. Well, um, it's been a while since I've made a video, which, again, I don't really care about the algorithm. I just make these to vent. Probably should try to grow the channel more, but I've never really been interested in YouTube as a career so much as I've always seen YouTube as an outlet when I'm not bored or when I am bored or whatever. That's not to say I don't respect my audience. I do. I do. It's just after my whole libertarian crusade thing went full circle and all these libertarian right wing hacks started joining the alt right and essentially proving everything that confirming everything that we on the left have said about right wing libertarians and Austrian economics proponents for since forever to be true. That it really was just a front for white nationalism. I had to ask myself, where do I go from here? I mean, I could just go back to talking about the religious right and having rants about them, but that's been done to death. Everyone and their mother, even right wing libertarian atheists have their beef with the religious right, and uh, I so it's like, what could I say about the religious right and Christian nationalists that hasn't already been said a million times over? What could I say about libertarians that men who are far wiser than me have already said a million times over? I suppose I could talk about Ron DeSantis' little stunt with asylum seekers, his little human trafficking stunt that he pulled just to appeal to Republican voters. I could talk about him being a disgusting piece of human garbage, but talking about Ron DeSantis being a scumfuck is kind of redundant at this point because it's the age of Trump and you expect it from Republicans. Of course, we all knew Republicans were going to get to this point eventually. I mean, I don't really consider Republicans today to be any different from Republicans from the 1940s and 50s. It's just that conservatives back in the old days, before FDR's voters died of old age, back before the New Deal coalition passed on, they knew well enough to behave themselves because there were people alive who remembered the last time they were in charge of things before the 1932 elections, and they were walking on eggshells around older voters who would punish them severely if they went too damn far with their economic Darwinism. That's not to say that those older voters weren't a bunch of racist assholes and misogynistic assholes and had a thing for attacking marginalized groups themselves. I mean, hell, Jim Crow was a thing all the way up until the 1960s. So, but at the same time, those same those same older New Deal generation voters did not trust the Republican Party or the conservatives with power because they remember what it was like to starve in the streets. They remember what it was like to lose literally everything because of the Calvin Coolidges and Warren Hardings of the world. So, um, you know, so conservatives for the longest time they didn't say shit like, "Oh, uh, uh, FDR was a closet commie" or something. They said it while he was alive, but once the New Deal coalition were successful, um, and Republicans, or should I say the right wing of the Republican Party, the Barry Goldwaters of the world, realized that they weren't going to be getting back into power anytime soon. They sort of toned it down for the longest. Yeah, they still thought it. They still said it in their little John Birch Society meetings. But the ones who were elected, they sort of steered away from stuff that would clue the older crowd who were basically the parents of the baby boomers. They sort of steered away from that shit because they didn't want to clue them in. You know, so I don't feel as if I could talk about that. Um, so instead, I decided, why not just touch on a subject that's been done to death by Republicans, only do it from a leftist perspective. Now, if you're any leftist or liberal who's been online for, well, at any time in the past 30 years, you've come across a conservative who sat around talking about how they were going to round up all the lefties and kill us. Oh, there's going to be a second civil war, Red Dawn, the storm is coming, the storm is coming, you just wait. They've been saying this shit for years, and many of us, we used to think they were full of shit. To a certain extent, they still are, but then January the 6th happened, and we all we realized that it wasn't that they wouldn't do it. Oh, my neighbors are outside. They're probably on the back, either barbecuing or something. They tend to do that a lot. They love their barbecue. God, I wish I had enough time to barbecue. Fuck. Um, just something about working a night shift, 12-hour night shift, doing manual labor that just wears me out to the point where it's like my first day off, I spend the whole thing sleeping just to recover. But going back to the point of this video, um, these conservatives, all these far right activists, these people who voted for Donald Trump, who for years kept saying, "Oh, well, if you don't like America, you can get the fuck out." They're a dime a dozen down here in Alabama. These people, it's not that they weren't going to do it per se, it's that they were waiting for someone to be in charge who would give them permission. Donald Trump gave them permission. He gave them permission to do what they've wanted to do since. Oh, God damn it. Oh, sorry. Let me just readjust this fucking phone. Yeah, I know this is lame. But I'm not going to edit this out. I prefer to let my foibles, leave my foibles in, because this is an off the cuff, just totally unscripted rant. So I don't do editing. Sorry, but these people, these conservatives, they were waiting for someone to come along and give them permission. Someone who would make them feel like they wouldn't have to suffer consequences for their actions. George W. Bush wouldn't do this. This is why, despite George W. Bush being in the White House, you didn't see. This was in part a big part of why the far right didn't revamp the militia movement after Clinton was out of office, because they didn't have that person yet who would give them permission to do that. And I guess they realized it was a no-go then, especially with federal law enforcement being so vamped up after 9/11. But then the 2008 election came and went, and all these rural white shit-kicking hicks, driven by racism, they started joining right-wing militias in drove. They revived the right-wing paramilitary element. And in 2009 alone, right-wing militia membership went up by 700%. Then it went up by 700% again the following year. And now this is where we're at. And it's been their influence on the right has steadily increased since the 2008 presidential election. So I guess it's time I got to the point of this video. Why do conservatives think that if they got their long pined for second civil war, why do they believe that they would be the ones who came out on top? Why do they believe that they would be the ones who walked away with it? I mean, if you look at the history of every domestic conflict that occurred within a transcontinental country between an urban, more cosmopolitan, and decidedly more liberal uh, faction, and the more rural, more militaristic, more conservative faction, in almost every case, the conservative faction gets their ass absolutely bodied. I mean, it was that way during the Russian Civil War in the 1920s. It was that way during the war between the states in the 1860s. Because again, the North was far more urban, far more liberal in their social views than the South, and they were far less. The South had a deeper military history. Hell, it was. I would go so far as to say it was the same in China as well. Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalists got absolutely destroyed by the People's Liberation Army, the PLO. Mao and his PLO. I'm just like, I don't like lumping Mao in with us because that guy was, I know this is going to sound contentious, but Mao, he was a scumfuck who didn't really care about his own people whatsoever. I mean, he was good at one thing, and that was winning a war against Chiang Kai-shek, who himself was a bad person. I mean, millions of people died under Chiang Kai-shek, just like they did later under Mao. So the people in China were largely just trading one bad guy for another. I mean, hell, Hitler loved the Chinese nationalists for a reason, though he ultimately chose the Japanese over them when the Japanese invaded, but in 1937. But if you look at all these conservatives, you look at all the history of civil wars that have occurred since the start of the 19th century, especially when geography was not on their side, the conservatives, they really don't do well. The nationalists do not do well. I mean, fuck. Just I probably should have prepared this is probably one video I probably should have prepared better for, but if you look at every advantage the conservative faction in our own country has, if they ever got their way, if they ever got what they wanted, for every advantage they have, there's an advantage they don't have. They have no centers of civilization. They have no major urban areas that they can produce war materials from. 65% of the country's economic output come from quote unquote blue states. Where are they going to get the money to fund their military industrial complex? And moreover, the gun advantage really isn't as big as they think it is. I mean, Democrats went out and bought between 3 and 400 million guns before Trump got elected. Yeah, Republicans still have, conservatives still have an edge on that because they've been doing it for so much longer, but it's not as big as it used to be. It's not as clear cut as it used to be. It's like the right wing, the one major definitive advantage that they have over us is the fact that they've always been more organized. I mean, they certainly aren't going to have that many foreign allies. I mean, yeah, Russia might help them, Hungary might help them, but every other Western nation, countries like Australia, literally every country in Latin America that isn't Brazil, Canada, they'd probably throw their weight behind us. Because they're not going to want a bunch of Christian nationalists and white nationalists getting their hands on the levers of power and forming a totalitarian state in the U.S. on the tail end of a civil war. They're just not going to, because they don't want them having access to an atomic arsenal. Moreover, 2/3 of all people who are military age voted for Joe Biden in the last election. Who are they going to recruit? Hell, every other Gen Z chud online that you see is those guys are nothing to write home about. What good are those fuckers? These neckbeard types and these basement dwellers. What good are these Patriot Front types who, if you've seen the leaked videos, shit's pretty cringe. You know, I don't really see these guys really bringing the best in a combat situation. And I'm saying this as somebody who who lives in the most conservative state in America, Alabama, the most conservative state in the country, based on the overall percentage of the population calling themselves conservatives. We have the highest percentage of self-described conservatives at 51% of any state in the union. I go outside and I look around and I'm like, these motherfuckers think they're gonna win a civil war? It's like every other redneck is either really fucking skinny, they're like a twig, or they're like a blimp. None of these people are combat ready. Yeah, they know how to shoot a gun. So what? So do I. I grew up in the backwoods just like any of these people. What? Moreover, how would these people go about preventing someone like me from pretending to be a right winger? Since I know the lingo, I used to be on the far right. I was a far right libertarian back in my early 20s. How would these people go about preventing someone like me from pretending to be one of them and just knifing them in their sleep? Just just something about the way conservatives think. It's like they've convinced themselves that I don't know. I guess they care more about the power fantasy. They've always cared more about the murder revenge power fantasy than they actually do about whether or not they'd win. Which I don't really think we'd ever get around to having a open, like, direct civil war between us, because for one, the U.S. government would never allow it. The military would fucking crush every one of us if we got out of line. And I do mean all of us if we start fighting, because they're not going to abide by two factions within their own country fighting. And according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the most recent studies by the Southern Poverty Law Center, only about 1 in 4 members of the U.S. military have far-right proclivities. So they're going to be outnumbered 3 to 1 by military service people who don't have that. And even those among the far right who have those proclivities, who are in the service, not all of them are going to want to throw away everything, their job and everything, to risk being thrown in the brig or being put on their hands and knees and having their brains blown out across the fucking concrete for some power fantasy that they know will likely never get off the ground. But let's just say conservatives do manage to get past the military, assuming they can't weaponize it despite all of their infiltration attempts and their attempts at infiltrating law enforcement at the state and local and municipal levels. Let's assume that they managed to get past this barrier and somehow managed to get past us. Again, 2/3 of all people who are military aged voted for Biden in the last presidential election, despite not liking him, because they just hated those assholes more. And again, we have the centers of civilization. The economic bloodline of America is something we control. And almost all red areas do their business with the international market through blue cities. So they would effectively be cut off both by geography and by circumstance if they ever tried to get out of line with us. So every conservative and his mother would be living in a cardboard box by the time they ever got this whole shebang off the ground. Assuming they get past that, they still have to worry about a foreign country that might have beef with us, that who have been waiting for the stakes to get high enough to come in and finish them off. They're going to be so severely weakened, they're not going to be able to hold on to whatever they have. Whatever territory they've captured, they're done. They're spent. a foreign military would just be able to come in and just steamroll them. I don't care whether it's Russia, China, because I don't really think conservatives would be able to do the same thing with the Russian military that the Ukrainian freedom fighters have. I don't see it. I just given the way these people act, I just don't see them being the kinds of people who could win against a foreign invader. Hell, even some rink-eating country in a second tier area of the world would be able to come in and basically silly slap them if they were in a weakened state. And even if they managed to get past those three obstacles, foreign invasion, us, their opposition, and the military, even if they got through all of this and came out the other end, they wouldn't have enough manpower left over to secure the country. They wouldn't have enough manpower to keep any insurrection or any rebellion from rising up. They would effectively be trying to police an area as big as all of Western Europe with maybe half the manpower that the U.S. Army had during the occupation of Iraq. They would, because they wouldn't be able to, regardless of who actually won a hypothetical civil war between the left and the right, at least a third of America would be refugees. They'd be either trying to leave the country or they'd be refugees in their own country. And additionally, regardless of who won, God, I'm not making any sense. I'm not being coherent right now. Regardless of who won, the vast majority of the population would probably resent whoever came out on top, which means whoever won this hypothetical second civil war, storm is coming scenario that every right-winger and his mother have been preaching about since the 1920s, that person is going to wind up being hated by the country as a whole. It's just, I don't see conservatives as being the kinds of people who could actually handle having the entire country hate them and view them as occupiers instead of being viewed as patriots as they like to see themselves. And in the absence of the left, conservatives have a tendency to turn on each other. Their camaraderie is pretty fucking fake. Without some outside group, even if they got their little ethno state or whatever, a post-Civil War America would be basically Richard Spencer getting his way and wishing he didn't get his way, because by the time they ran out of outgroups to hate, to marginalize, to genocide out of existence, these right wingers, they would turn on each other. They would not be able to hold their own country for very long. And that's to say nothing about the international community not wanting to have anything to do with them because they would see them as a threat to world peace. They'd be isolated, they'd be poor, broke, they'd literally have nothing by the time it was over with. And most of these conservatives who these conservative figures and billionaires who preach all this shit, like Dennis Prager, Tim Pool, and fucking Steven Crowder and Ben Shapiro, these people who've actually been preaching this shit, like Mark Levin, they're going to jump on a plane and get the hell out of Dallas. They're not. And even the rank and file conservatives are going to think there's something funny about how these people disappeared when the fighting was going on, only to reappear later and try to snatch up a smidge of credit. Now that liberals are gone, now that we're dead, or should I say, once we're dead, those fuckers aren't going to have any use to rank and file conservatives. Their entire shtick was basically feeding the run-of-the-mill right-wing hacks confirmation bias fix. Feeding that drug habit of theirs. Giving them that liberal bashing and leftist bashing cottage industry that they've thrived on since the end of the Second World War. If they have no further use, Do they really think that they're just going to be able to come in and assert some kind of power over other conservatives? They're going to be viewed as cowards. They may as well not even come back if they decide to jump on a plane and get out before the action starts. Because they'll probably be killed the minute they get off the plane if they ever return. So the regardless of how you slice it, there's no way a civil war would ever turn out well for the American right. They don't have the numbers. Yeah, they have territory because of geography and because they've tried everything they could to geographically isolate the Democrats politically, but that doesn't help them in a domestic conflict. It, so between the recruitment problem and the lack of resources, the lack of manpower, the lack of centers of civilization where war materials can be produced, the lack of just all these different disadvantages that the right wing would have in a hypothetical civil war. I just I just find it odd that so many Republicans who especially quote unquote historian Republicans who keep pushing this idea that, oh, well, if there's a civil war, we got this and that. They never really look at the disadvantages. They never actually talk about how they would be. They don't really talk about the post-war period. They don't really talk about how they're going to hold on to whatever they take. It really is just a power fantasy to them, and it would be, and it's a power fantasy that would quickly become a case of of the dog catching the car and just not knowing what to do with it. They'd be fucked. I mean, there's a reason why domestically political violence in America by the far right is almost entirely confined to 20 something socially stunted suburban white chuds going on a shooting spree, like that guy like the shooter from Buffalo, New York, and the South Carolina shooter Dylan Roof, and that Kyle Rittenhouse jackass. Just because conservatives understand that if they actually, I think, or at least on some level, I think they do understand that if they got what they wanted, it would be the biggest disaster ever. There's no way they'd be able to come out the other end of that smelling like roses. They'd lose far, far more than we ever did because they're dependent on the federal government. Almost every Republican state is a federal tax sinkhole. They're a federal tax dollar sinkhole that's being kept propped up by Washington. They'd be done for. They'd be fucked. And there's no way they'd be able to go through with their ideological goals, particularly the Heritage Foundation and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's laundry list, because if they sold off all the assets that are part of the public sphere in the aftermath of that and tried to create their little ownership society that they were preaching about during the Tea Party years, they'd be sunk. I mean, just I wouldn't be surprised if all these conservatives, if they managed to win a hypothetical second civil war against us, I wouldn't be surprised if at least half of them went full on leftist as soon as they realized the hard way that we were right all along. And given the fact that such a country would be homogenous, like many of the countries in Europe and such, where they wouldn't be able to use the whole race thing as a weapon. And I'm not saying that, I'm not giving credence to that idea. I'm just saying that events in Sweden recently with the election of their center right government and everything, you using anti-immigrant sentiments to get elected. Uh, yeah, it'd be pretty hard to keep their coalition together without an outside group to hate on. But anyway, those are my thoughts on the issue. I I just I just don't see conservatives coming out of any civil war situation as the victors, whether it be post-war or whatever. There's just no way they could there's no way they'd survive. All right. Peace out, everybody.